Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. With me today is Daniel McAdams, and it's good to see you again, Daniel.
Good morning, Dr. Paul.
Good. Subject today is Afghanistan. It's been a subject on this program quite a few times. Is it any wonder? We've been fighting a war over there for 14 years, and it doesn't look like it's ending real soon. Matter of fact, the president recently boosted the numbers of troops who would be there. 140,000 at one time, down to 14,000. He was going to have 8,000. He goes on and on. So there's a change, though, and we have an article, changing information coming from NATO leaders, because this is not a U.S. war. We just pay for it and die for it and direct it, but it's NATO's war, that peace organization. So they're complaining now. There are signs that they're wearing down. The one article at Reuters was, NATO ponders future of Afghan mission as fatigue, frustration mounts. Well, it ought to after 14 years, longer than Vietnam, and we ought to be fatigued. But for some reason, one reason why the American people aren't outraged, they're getting there, but we don't have a draft, we don't have as many Americans dying, but it's still a very devastating process, and it should wake up our government and our political leaders and the people in this country that there's something deeply flawed in here. And in the article, they stated a NATO official that said that we need advice. We need to get some robust advice. So let's consider giving those clowns a little bit of advice on how they ought to be acting when it comes to Afghanistan.
Stay out is good advice. But
that's simple, but that's obviously the case.
But after 14 years, that NATO's involved in training and advising the Afghan army, which doesn't really exist. It's probably in worse shape than the Iraqi army was before it turned and ran. But here's a great quote from the same general. It's a German general, General Lothar Domrose, Hans Lothar Domrose, who said, "If we don't stay, they will drift into a maelstrom. There is a significant danger that they will get torn away." So 14 years.
Yeah. And guess what? The clock runs on the spending clock, too. It's not cheap, but that doesn't bother the military-industrial complex, and it seems like from recent events we've seen on the debates, it doesn't seem to bother either party that the military-industrial complex is well protected, and so they have no complaints. So it's well over $1 trillion now. But we never know when it'll end if you're talking about dollars. But of course, there's a lot of lives been destroyed, our side as well as the other side. I mean, how many lives did the Afghan people lose? And they weren't all people that had been dedicated to the destruction of America. A lot of them, matter of fact, the purpose of Taliban is just to kick foreigners out. It's not to come over here and drop bombs on us. So this whole idea, these games that we play, they think that, well, if we tinker around the edges and we train people and do certain things, maybe there'll be more success. But one thing, I don't believe they're going to have success tinkering around with the way they're managing things. But the one thing that they don't ever talk about is what's the downside? What's the unintended consequences? What is the blowback potential? Because they do get sick and tired. And then the other question now, and it's part of this debate, is where does Russia fit in? Russia's been on the receiving end of NATO for a long time, and maybe they'll be satisfied where the lines are drawn in Europe, but I don't think they're satisfied about the east and going east. So they might be just paying a lot more attention to what's going on in Afghanistan.
Well, Afghanistan is not in our backyard, but it definitely is in Russia's backyard. And I think people may forget, that we went into Afghanistan in the direct response to 9/11 because the Taliban government had allowed Al-Qaeda to train there. But the Taliban were not our enemies. They didn't attack us. They didn't participate in 9/11. Yet, even once we went in and got all of the Al-Qaeda out of Afghanistan, we stayed there to fight the Taliban. And while there was no, we got rid of Al-Qaeda, there was no ISIS in Afghanistan, Now we're seeing that ISIS is starting to blow things up in Afghanistan. It's moving into Afghanistan. So as you point out with Russia, that just lends them some more reason to be nervous about what's happening to the failed state called Afghanistan.
And it seems like they have a more precise philosophy than when you have so many different countries coming together and they're not precise. And I'm talking about NATO. How can NATO represent U.S. national security? And yet they're supposed to be doing this. And yet they can't possibly do this because it's only the American people who can really speak on this. But it's this idea of having a war, but it's not a war. You know, they don't declare war. It's just like we go over there and we overthrow dictators, not only in Afghanistan, but Iraq, the whole mess. We have wars, we don't call them wars. We don't follow the rules. If there is a war, it's supposed to be declared by, the Congress and the people, and that never happens. That has to have something to do with the lack of knowing when you win. Without debating the pros and cons of World War I and World War II on what could have been done, but at least the philosophy there was that if there was a determined enemy that was posing a threat, that a war could be declared, and they knew exactly when the war would be over. But in this case, they don't have the vaguest idea. So the frustration that they have, I don't think they should be surprised.
But part of the reason is the NATO's drift. NATO was conceived as a defensive alliance against the Soviet Union and the Soviet bloc. But at the end of '89, when that dissolved, just as the Warsaw Pact had dissolved, NATO should have dissolved. But instead they went looking for more missions, and they became not only an aggressive force. The first attempt was in Serbia when they led the bombing of Serbia, which is a country that had not attacked anyone. And then they moved on out of Europe, and they're involved everywhere, Asia, Africa. So NATO lost its way. Just goes to show that government programs will never shut down. There are a lot of good jobs and a lot of goodies for these people.
Okay, I think you and I certainly could agree on the advice that we could give those who are seeking the advice. Dissolve NATO. And of course, I'd bring all the troops home too. But recently I saw an interview of a former NATO Secretary General, Rasmussen. And I found it rather interesting because he was being interviewed by, it looked more like Mid-Easterners, and they were sharp and they were determined. And they didn't allow him to get off the hook, but they were anti-war and they were anti-NATO. And they said, what good have you done? And they listed all the times that NATO, whether it was Syria or whether it was Libya and Ukraine and all these places, total failure. And he couldn't deny that. He said, yes, that is true. It's total chaos. But we did our job. We are a military operation, and we're out there to get rid of these terrible people and get rid of the dictator. And they came back and he said, well, yeah, but you're leaving chaos there. It's turmoil. And he said, yes, but that's not our fault. He stuck to his guns. He says, that's not our fault. It's up to the civilian people to come in and establish their governments after we have blown up their first government. So it was just unbelievable where this thinking comes from. I don't know whether they have just brainwashed themselves or think that that's a possibility, that you blow up a government, no matter what the pros and cons are, but that it's just going to be automatic that people will rise up. And yeah, they rise up, and you have 14 different groups, and they all want our money and they all want our support. And then they wonder why it's failure, why it's frustration, why there's fatigue, and why it's costing us a lot of money.
And they pretend that they weren't the ones pushing for war, but if you look at Rasmussen, go back and look at the speeches he gave in advance of Libya. Look at Stoltenberg, the current Secretary General of NATO. Both of these people are extremely political figures. They push these wars. They push the Libya war based on a lie, and then they step back and say, hey, it's not our fault that it's a disaster.
Yeah, and there's be nothing we should say about the European nations getting together, and dealing with this, but we don't need to be in there, involved in it. But the NATO-backed problem that we're all facing now in Ukraine, of course, we participate in getting rid of one leader and ushering in a new one. But this just sort of prompts Russia to become more aggressive. Why out of the clear blue a year or so ago, we decided to just antagonize and provoke Russia, and now, we put our missiles right up on their borders. And then they give this cockamamie lie, we're going to stop the Korean missiles from overflowing. They're going to put them in Eastern Europe. I mean, it's insane. And then what does Russia say? Russia says they don't have the anti-ballistic missiles, but we do have offensive weapons, and we're going to have them here in case you guys mess around. This is our only defense. So it just goes back and forth. It just seems so unnecessary for all the provoking, since there was a relative breathing area after the Soviets collapsed. I mean, we were trading. We still do some of this trading, and yet it just seemed like somebody was obsessed with, we can't allow this to happen. We have to stop this. We have to have an enemy, a constant enemy.
Well, the new chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff said in his confirmation hearing that Russia is the greatest existential threat to us, more than ISIS. But it's funny what you said about NATO. It's not our business to reconstruct, to fix these things. But I don't even know what's worse, whether NATO would do it or how we're doing it. You and I both follow this story about this $43 million gas station that the Defense Department built in Afghanistan, and it should have cost, according to local costs, less than $500,000 to build this. But construction costs and supervision costs and everything, all of a sudden it's a compressed natural gas station in a small village in Afghanistan that this agency, Task Force for Business and Stability Operations, determined that would be good for the local economy, so they built it. They wasted $43 million, and as our friend Peter Van Vuren points out, the Afghans aren't going to be able to use it because their cars use gasoline. To convert their cars to use compressed gas will cost $700 per car, but they only make $690 a year.
Of course, an incident like that is important to point out because you can comprehend it. But that's peanuts compared to, remember the truckloads of money that they hauled into Iraq and they passed it out? And how about the hundreds of millions of dollars that we spend to train 5 people who surrender, and all the weapons we buy? The whole thing is nuts. And if the American people would only get this information, and tragically, there's so little real debate on this. So what do? We hear almost all of the Republican candidates talking this way, but then you have Hillary. And she supports it too. She's a wilder hawk than some of the Republicans.
And somehow you're weak on defense if you oppose these truckloads of money that that I think Rand pointed out last night. This weakens us. If you want to have a strong military and a strong country, you can't hemorrhage money like this while antagonizing people.
The only thing that I think is worthwhile exporting would be a good philosophy, a philosophy of liberty. At one time we had a bit of that in this country. We believed in sound money and free markets and contracts and civil liberties. And those are good things. And if we could only practice what we preach or pretend that we can force on other people, maybe we would have a thriving economy. Maybe we wouldn't be number 20th in the world for defense of liberty. If we did that and showed what kind of prosperity could come, maybe somebody would want to voluntarily emulate us. That is what we need. But this whole idea that we can spread American exceptionalism with a gun, and besides, it's no longer exceptional in the positive way when we think we can do it this way. So this is going to end. It's leading to the bankruptcy. I'm delighted that the NATO leaders now are frustrated. They don't know what to do, and they're looking for advice. So I strongly give their advice. Just disband and send everybody home. And of course, the only policy that we might have any direct relationship would be an American policy. I think we should be out of NATO. Robert Taft advised we never join, and this is the result of it. It's just provoking wars unnecessarily and subsidizing the military-industrial complex. No more war profiteering. That should be our slogan. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report, and please come back soon.